thank you everyone for joining today. So we've got Paul Elton, who is a PhD scholar from ANU. He's also working with our team, CBCS. The research is applied social science. Paul's using this to kind of understand the costs and funding of private conservation in Australia. He's also a non-executive director at Greening Australia and with Nature Co. So two companies that are focusing on nature-based solutions to answer climate change issues and tackle climate change issues. And today Paul will be talking to us about the acceleration of the establishment of privately protected areas in New South Wales since 2017. Is that correct? And the role that those will play in meeting Australia's biodiversity goals and targets. So Paul, if you'd like to begin.
Thank you. Thanks for coming, everyone. And I'd like to firstly acknowledge country that we're meeting on today. What is the traditional owners of this land here?
Yagara.
Yagara. Okay. Well, I hail from Yuin country, which is the south coast of New South Wales, and I still spend some time in Yuin country in the beautiful Jervis Bay. But I'm based in Sydney in Gadigal country, and I spend a bit of time now on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country in Canberra. So yeah, so I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners of country across Australia and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd like to also acknowledge my co-author, James Fitzsimmons. It was actually James's idea to write this paper at the beginning of last year. And it turned out to be quite a serendipitous moment in my life because it became beginnings of actually getting into the idea of doing a PhD in this space. So, but I'm going to talk about the paper that we wrote last year. The paper is really about highlighting some of the innovative features that we brought in to increase, enhance the role of private land conservation and privately protected areas in New South Wales. Hopefully to have some policy impact by demonstrating the merits of that new regime. So that's what the paper is about. So I naturally prefer Q&A, so I'm going to talk a little bit and then I'm going to open it up for Q&A because I think that's generally more interesting for people. That's my view. So look, the paper, you know, and I encourage those of you who have a particular interest in this field to read it. It sets initially some of the context for protected areas in Australia, for privately protected areas in New South Wales. And, you know, there is, and it acknowledges that there is beginning to be an emerging recognition globally and in Australia that privately protected areas can play a significant role in the biodiversity conservation mission. It then goes on to just set the scene in terms of the New South Wales reforms and how this came about. If you want to ask me later some questions about how this came about, I'd be very interested to answer those questions because it's quite an interesting story. But what I'll do first is just quickly run through some of the more interesting features. Try to do that again. There we go. So we've highlighted in the paper about 12 features that we described as being innovations in the model. I mean, looking back on it now, I'd probably say some were more innovative than others, but you know, it was also, if you like, needs to be seen holistically in terms of the framework we put together. So this was done in the context of what were branded as the land management and biodiversity conservation reforms that ran in New South Wales for the period from about 2013 through till enactment of the new Biodiversity Conservation Act in 2016 and then commencement with regulations in 2017. And your very own Hugh Possingham was involved in the reform process. He was on the expert panel that I worked with during the earlier part of that time on the review process. So the opportunity, well, the BCT and the new private land conservation program emerged out of that reform process. We did have a PLC regime in New South Wales. As it is in many other parts of the country, it was fragmented, it was poorly funded. In fact, there'd been a disinvestment in it in the recent decade, really. So it was running on the smell of an oily rag. There was a thing called the Nature Conservation Trust, which the BCT replaced. It was running a revolving fund model and doing a little bit of other commission work, but really not achieving very much at all, to be honest. So anyway, so this opportunity emerged. So what we were able to do through the reform process, modernise the legislative architecture for PLC in New South Wales, modernising the provisions around the types of private land conservation agreements. We also built some innovations in. So a couple of key ones were power for there to be a biodiversity conservation investment strategy. The legislation provides for the minister to make that strategy on the advice of the department in New South Wales. So it essentially sets the guiding principles for where the BCT should invest in private land conservation. The first strategy was made in 2018, and it was, in my view, quite impressive in being science and evidence-based. And let's hope it stays that way. It's meant to be reviewed every 5 years. It's now 4 years. It's now 6 years old and it hasn't been reviewed yet. That's government. So in the Act, there's provisions for private land conservation agreements, there's provisions for the strategy, and then there's provisions effectively constituting the Biodiversity Conservation Trust. And the other innovation at the legislative level, I'll come to on the next page, I think. Oh no, this page. It was I haven't particularly got it up there, but it was the creation of the Biodiversity Conservation Fund. So we already had the Old Nature Conservation Trust already had a public fund, which is what you use for charitable purposes, so donations. That was preserved, and the BCT still had that. There was also a fund in relation to the biodiversity offsets scheme, but we created a dedicated fund for private land conservation called the Biodiversity Conservation Fund, and that became really important. I'll talk more about that in a moment. Point 3 up there is really important. Trust and transparency. I have a philosophy that I don't like this particular terminology, but I'll use it anyway. But a philosophy that private land conservation is essentially a public-private partnership. It's a partnership between landholders and government. But it needs to be a special kind of relationship because you're trying to really enter into a relationship of trust around convincing landholders that you want them to enter into mainly in perpetuity arrangements and to commit to that for all of the public good benefits that brings. There's also an argument, in my view, for government to be involved in funding this. So government needs to be in there, but it also needs to be structured in a way that creates trust for landholders, that they're not going to be subject to the whims of future governments. So there's a bit in the paper that I encourage you to read around understanding how we tried to strike that balance. What mechanisms did we put in place that tried to create some degree of independence? So we had a set, what I would describe as the semi-independent board, and we had a whole lot of very explicit transparency arrangements around the BCT's business plan needing to be published, any directions from the minister needing to be published. And all of these they sound somewhat bureaucratic, but they were really important mechanisms to get the balance right in trying to create that model that would work in terms of getting landholders to buy in, because it all relies on voluntary participation. The other big innovation, if I can call it that, was getting money to do this really well. Now, through the reform process, we extracted a commitment to $70 million a year ongoing. That was quite a breakthrough in the biodiversity conservation space. At the same time, we got some new money for the Saving Our Species program in New South Wales. Not enough, but we got an extra 20 million a year. And that's been continued. It was only for 5 years initially, but this was a commitment to ongoing money, still subject to the whims of every subsequent annual budget process, but the political commitment was there. That breaks down into about 25 million a year on point 4. That breaks down into about 25 million a year of spending on the BCT's operations, program design, program delivery being about bringing new people into private land conservation and supporting the extant PLC landholders in New South Wales, of which there are around, I think, 1,800, 2,000 when the BCT came into existence. As I said earlier, the whole program had been defunded, And a lot of those landholders had in perpetuity private land conservation agreements and never heard from anyone in government. There was no support. Occasionally there was a small grants program. I put a lot of focus on reinvesting in that existing base as well as building. So a big chunk of that 25 million a year goes to technical support, small grants for the big existing base of voluntary private land conservation agreement holders. For the new ones, we've built funding because you've effectively got a growth model. So we've built funding into the way we structure the arrangements as part of stream 5 here, which was the investment side. So we build up an accumulating fund to help with that ongoing work of landholder support. And I want to talk about the emphasis on quality as well as quantity in a minute. So yeah, about 25 million for operations and all those other elements, and then 45 million for investment in private land conservation agreements. And I use that term quite deliberately. So we're not relying on recurrent funding to pay for the annual payments. What we did was we created effectively what I've characterised as an accumulating endowment fund model. So essentially through the programs that the BCT ran to offer funded agreements to people through conservation tenders and fixed price offers. I won't go into all the details of the delivery mechanisms, but essentially once we got to the point where we were saying, okay, out of this program we've run, we're going to enter into 12 agreements with landholders up here in the northwest of New South Wales, we would work out using a complex set of equations to calculate the present value. We would work out the present value of that agreement over its lifetime, including all the in perpetuity agreements. And we would capitalise that and put that amount aside in the Biodiversity Conservation Fund, invest it in inflation hedged investment vehicles, i.e. in the financial markets through our Treasury Corporation, but essentially putting aside the capital that would support that agreement in perpetuity. So if a future government decided to stop giving the BCT 45 million a year, which there's always a risk that it'll do that, all those that have signed up in perpetuity agreements in the meantime will have that funding guaranteed because it's held in trust by the BCT, invested in inflation hedged investments. There's some risk management you have to take into account there. It gets quite technical, but this was a core innovation in my view, because one of the persistent challenges we've seen with private land conservation up until now, and still exists in most of Australia, is the ongoing funding problem. You'll often see, philanthropic efforts or ENGOs who are out there acquiring properties. Sometimes they manage them themselves ongoing, sometimes they divest them to other parties. But there's often a problem with the ongoing funding side. There might be some short-term arrangement for funding initially, but then often it would dry up. And the same with what we had previously in New South Wales, 2,000 agreement holders who might have had some small grants in the past or got some initial money and then nothing. And as we all know, conservation management requires ongoing effort to deal with never-ending threats that arise. So to me, that was a core innovation in the model we put in place. So I've really described 5 and 6. I'm doing what I said I wouldn't do and talk too much, but I'll keep going. We also, I won't dwell on these, but one of the nice things about getting some serious money into this was we were able to then put in place a spectrum of programs, a spectrum of delivery mechanisms, different opportunities for different landholders in different circumstances. So a more choice, and that led to greater engagement. I was telling Martine earlier, we then, in the latter time I was there, we started getting into the space of co-investment partnerships, which was one way you can think of it is that initially our approach was basically bilateral agreements and bilateral investment between us, BCT, and the landholder. And the level of cost sharing was variable in those different outcomes. We then wanted to start bringing in third-party investors. So at the sort of 4-year mark, we were getting to the point where we had some credibility, that we had high integrity mechanisms for biodiversity conservation on private land, and we wanted to extend our reach and impact by starting to bring in third-party investors. And just before I left, we'd struck a deal with Telstra, for example, to co-invest with us in a joint biodiversity plus carbon biodiversity conservation tender. We also entered into a joint venture with the Nature Conservancy and the Ngari Ngari Tribal Council to establish a very large-scale private land conservation agreement on the Guyini Nimikaira site in southwestern New South Wales, which is where that image comes from. Massive wetland system. We ended up with a 55,000 hectare agreement worth about $40 million in capital and worth about $1 million a year in conservation management payments with an Indigenous landholder. So that was quite an iconic outcome in my view. We were able to strengthen other delivery mechanisms like the revolving fund by again bringing in ongoing conservation management payments rather than just buying properties, flipping them, putting them into conservation and then forgetting about them. Conservation partners grants. As I said before, we put in place arrangements for the holders of what I call voluntary agreements, so unfunded agreements, to get access to small grants to assist with conservation management challenges. One of the unintended or unforeseen consequences of that was that we then faced huge exponential growth in demand for voluntary conservation agreements because suddenly people realised that this was a good opportunity again. And within the first 6 months of the BCT's life, we had a backlog of 200 applications for voluntary conservation agreements. It's quite phenomenal. But people saw that we were offering a much better model. So that was a really positive outcome. And I think even today, the BCT is probably still playing catch up with that demand. Enabling adaptive management was really important. One of the real problems that landholders see, and particularly the farming and grazing sort of community, who will look at this as much as a business proposition as they will as an environmental proposition, was the sort of, oh, but you just set an agreement, it's in perpetuity. What happens if things change down the track? So we dealt with that by building in a provision in all of our conservation agreements that enable them to be subject to a landholder or BCT initiated review each 5 years that would enable the management plan to be amended if there was, say, a new threat that had emerged. It also provided, with a caveat, for a possible change in the funding arrangement if the BCT still had access to that $45 million a year to be able to fund it. So if a new threat emerged and with an additional cost, it would enable them to enter into a new funding arrangements as well as a new management plan. And that was very important to getting people across the line on the idea of in perpetuity agreements. And consistent with what I've said, the other big thing was that investing in technical support. So in terms of the BCT's operations, which was about 60% of the business, about 30% of that was devoted to getting people in, and the other 30% was devoted to landholder support, technical landholder support. So again, it's not just about money, but for the landholders, it's often as much about technical support, networks, all that sort of stuff. So we put a lot of emphasis into guidelines, education, all that sort of stuff. Just briefly, evidence of success. You can see the numbers. We tripled by area the rate at which we were establishing privately protected areas in New South Wales. But what I really want to give emphasis to, and you can see, if I go back to that image I showed you earlier, that's the part of the investment strategy, which has this spatial element, prioritises the state into 5 priority zones, and we were focused in priority 1, 2, 3 areas. And the investment strategy also had a whole lot of other guidance about the sort of assets we should go after, investment principles, all that sort of stuff. But you can see there's a big priority in the sheep wheat belt through the middle of New South Wales. There were other priorities like koala habitat, Monero grasslands, which is this little area here. And it's hard to actually see clearly this. I mean, you can see there's been this historical emphasis on voluntary conservation agreements through here, which is mainly altruistic landholders on lifestyle type properties wanting to do good things for the environment. If anything, we've got far too many down here, this is already hit car targets, this part of New South Wales. But you can see from the green dots, those were the funded agreements emerging out of our priority investment programs. And you can see we started to get a lot more outcomes in the sheep wheat belt. And they were typically much larger sites as well. But what I really want to emphasise here is the quality side of this. So you can talk about hectares as proxies for outcome. You can talk about numbers, but what really matters is the quality of the outcomes. And what we were able to do through all of this was put much more emphasis in investing in those overcleared landscapes, landscapes that are underrepresented in the protected area network, and a lot more support for existing and new landholders. You know, because it's got to be as much about or more about the quality of outcomes on these private land conservation sites, rather than just getting numbers. That's what the politicians always focus on, but you know, we want to focus on the quality of the outcomes. But obviously, we were able to achieve both of those things. So look, I won't spend too much time on this. I encourage you again to read the paper, but really we went on in the paper, James and I, to make some observations from this, mainly around encouraging other jurisdictions in Australia to look at this and look at these innovative elements, potentially pick them up in equivalent efforts in other jurisdictions. We made some observations at the time about emerging voluntary markets, because this paper was being written when the Commonwealth Government was still contemplating including offsets in its nature repair market legislation. So we found a hook to say something about that. Really it was about this idea of valuing privately protected areas, everything else being equal, more highly than other kinds of investment in nature conservation in the form of short-term, non-permanent arrangements or whatever it might be. And based on what we've done in New South Wales, we made some commentary around the idea that the states and territories need to establish viable private land conservation entities. And then we also made the case, as best as we could in this paper, for the idea that governments, including the Commonwealth and the states and territories, need to do a lot more to invest in private land conservation. And I'll keep repeating myself on that throughout my PhD. So that's it really. That's all I'll say in terms of talking to you. I really would like to just open it up to Q&A.
Thank you, Paul. That was amazing. A lot of very interesting things to take in there. Does anyone have any questions to begin with? Yeah.
Two things. Where is the paper published? And secondly, you were talking in the first part of the paper about the kind of costs that are involved in establishing as against maintaining privately owned conservation areas. Can you just say a little bit more about what the establishment costs are in terms of, for example, assessing the value or getting some sense of what further work is required to upgrade the quality of the proposal?
A couple of things to say about that. First thing to say about it is that we decided to internalise the assessment costs within the VCT. So unlike the biodiversity offset scheme, which has a very expensive assessment regime, we developed what we called a rapid assessment method. It was established by our ecologists, it was peer reviewed by CSIRO, and the VCT absorbed the cost of doing the assessment. So the way we would actually, if I think about our major delivery mechanisms, conservation tenders and fixed price offers, it was a two-step process. So we would first of all call for expression of interest. So if we were running a conservation tender, say for koala habitat in Port Macquarie, which is an actual example, we would set out the geographical scope of the conservation tender area. We would set up what kind of ecological assets we're looking for, and we would invite expressions of interest from landholders. We would promote it. We might get 30, 50, 60 landholders come in expressing interest in participating in the conservation tender. Before they actually tendered, we would then go through a process of site assessment, developing a conservation agreement, identifying the ecological assets on the site, desktop analysis initially to see if it was viable. We would design a conservation agreement. We would also use our assessment method to measure its biodiversity conservation value. Those that got through that initial stage, we would then perhaps get to a point where there were 30, say, that were still interested. We would then invite them to tender. So in a conservation tender, their tender would comprise the draft conservation agreement and management plan and their pricing of it. So they could put a pricing schedule together. Typically, what we would see would be higher costs in the first few years because of the higher establishment costs that might involve fencing, additional pest and weed control upfront, and then moving into more of a management regime. So you'd often see a costing profile that would be high initially and then tailing off. For in perpetuity agreements, we would have a sort of fixed pattern of payments beyond 20 years, essentially. We would then, that would be the second part of their tender. We would then assess value for money by using our biodiversity assessment metric, which was essentially the biodiversity value score derived from our assessment methodology divided by the present value, which is the price of the agreement, to rank the sites. We would also apply a whole lot of other criteria to test for value for money. And out of those 30 tenders, we might select 18 or 20 that we saw as being value for money. And those were the ones that would then be offered the opportunity to enter into an agreement. At that point, most of them would, but occasionally there'd be one or two that would drop off and not proceed. So partly we would absorb the assessment cost. Secondly, the costs of the upfront works to help improve the values would be higher in those initial years, but there'd be the ongoing maintenance costs as well for ongoing weed control, pest control, whatever it was in that particular environment. So that's how that worked. With fixed price offers, the only difference there was all the same, except the only difference there was that we were making a fixed price offer, which was we had a schedule of prices which were based on land capability, soil capability classes, LGAs. That was a mechanism that was an open offer that was available in all of those priority 1, 2, and 3 investment areas all of the time. People could express interest at any time, and we would batch them up and every year do a cost benefit analysis on those. That was really designed to kind of get some low-hanging fruit that were out there, people that were keen to come into conservation, but we would still be as rigorous in checking that it was going to be a value proposition. The conservation tenders were much more, typically more expensive because we were going after targeted assets, targeted ecological assets, in particular, high priority bioregions. If that makes sense. Does that answer your question, Brian?
Yeah, lovely. How the paper is published?
Sorry. It's in Frontiers in Conservation Science, and Kate sent a link to it in the email that went out this morning. Yeah.
Thank you, Paul, for the amazing talk. I have two questions for you. So I guess the first question is, as you pointed out, is so where you put in a tender within New South Wales will have a huge impact on what properties you end up getting. So what sort of criteria that you use to choose where to put out the tender?
Yeah.
So I guess also the second question we have time is that we've got as you mentioned, there are a lot of voluntary offers for people who are interested in voluntary conservation. So these are people who don't require the in perpetuity agreements. They might still require some.
Actually, all of our voluntary agreements were in perpetuity, actually.
Yeah. So
Yes.
yeah. Sorry. So my question is, how does it?
How do you
so why do we in that case want fixed price offers and other tender offers instead of just focusing or putting in more resources into dealing with voluntary agreements? Because in theory, you might be able to cover a lot more area if you just divert most of the resources to the voluntary.
Yeah, look, it's an interesting. We had lots of internal debates about these these prioritisation questions because we had multiple programs, multiple delivery pathways, and we were doing some as we were going, we were doing some evaluation to sort of work out how do we optimise, you know, where are we, how much money are we putting into tenders, fixed price offers, voluntary agreements, grants, etc. And as we were getting more and more data, we were able to do more and more optimisation. But to kick us off, what we started off with was some shotgun approaches where we did some broad acre tenders in a few key areas. And that was a very deliberate strategy to do some price discovery. So we went fairly broad initially in our first couple of rounds of tenders, and then we got more targeted over time. The biggest, it didn't look too bad in terms of the overall, when we did some evaluations at about the year 3, year 4 mark, it was looking reasonably good. The biggest shift we made was actually shifting a bit more effort, and in fact, my board agreed to an increase in landholder support officers. We wanted to get to that 50-50 split I described earlier. That's not where we started. So in fact, we decided we needed to put more investment in supporting existing landholders. So we shifted that balance. And we also gave a bit more emphasis to that idea of building into that capital amount that we would set aside. We didn't just build in provisions to support the annual payments to the landholders, we also built in provisions to support ecological monitoring, landholder support and agreement management, because we recognised that this was going to keep growing and we couldn't keep relying on the $25 million base funding to keep supporting all of those activities. So we effectively built an accumulating endowment fund for that side of it as well. That makes sense. So that was one of the major shifts we made in my time there. But I'd like to think that the environmental monitoring program we put in place will continue to be used to look at those very questions about optimisation. You know, we were typically putting 35 to 40 million a year into tenders, 5 to 10 million a year into fixed price offers. Is that the right balance? And again, how much effort into the voluntary side? The reason that we did end up with a bit of a backlog on the voluntary agreements, only because we got overwhelmed with demand. And so we then put strategies in place to kind of keep people in the tent. You know, we will get to you. It's like Telstra. Your call's really important to us. Your application's really important to us. And we kept saying to our staff, you know, you've got to keep these people in the tent, even if it's going to take us 6 months, 12 months to get to them. You know, this is a long-term thing. We're really keen to get to you. We will get to you, but we have to prioritise and manage demand. But we really wanted to keep, you know, I guess your question would be, well, should you take a year off from running tenders and catch up on all the voluntary agreements? The problem is a lot of the voluntary agreements were arising, still continuing to rise in areas where there was the least need from an ecological outcome point of view. So what we were wanting to do was focus on these parts of the state where the need is much greater from a conservation point of view. And that's, you know, and then really you are talking about those landholders who are predominantly business oriented, and you have to be able to find that balance in terms of appealing to them both from a point of view of conservation and it being a sensible business proposition, if that makes sense. Thank you. Thank you. I think you were first.
All right, good. I was really interested with how you were able to get so many private landowners on board with the across the in perpetuity agreements. And I'm wondering what aspects of it, the way you thought that the BCT was set up allowed that, because throughout central Queensland and trying to get producers talking about potentially wanting to retain regrowth on their properties.
Yeah.
A lot of them might be keen to do it, but because it's not really something that's they can trial on a small scale and see, okay, what does it look like in terms of its impact on my business and my productivity, because it's something that's going to take 20 years, they're really, really hesitant that by retaining regrowth now, they're going to be locked into something that them and their sons and daughters are committed to in another 30 years' time. It might turn out to be a disaster for their productive business. And so I'm really interested in how you try to navigate that
Yeah.
in the way that it was set up so that people felt a bit more assurance in engaging with those.
Yeah. Look, I mean, it's always set against a baseline of government regulation, right? So how much is government choosing to regulate land clearing? So that's and that varies. And I mean, in New South Wales, we saw in my view, a gross liberalisation of land clearing laws at the same time we were doing this. But fundamentally, the answer to your question is that it comes down to money. So, you know, when a landholder, say a hard-nosed grazier in central New South Wales is looking at, I mean, you've got to have first of all, it's typically farmers who have nevertheless a conservation ethic. You know, there is definitely a minority of landholders in New South Wales who hate greenies and hate the environment and will break the law, right? But the vast majority don't think like that. The vast majority actually have a positive view about the idea of conservation and understand, and especially the emerging younger farmers, they understand the concepts of, you know, a good ecologically well-functioning environment supports better productivity, blah, blah, blah. So, but fundamentally it comes down to money. So what we would encourage landholders to think about is sort of the 4 costs that come into the mix. So there's the transaction costs of getting into this in the first place, which might include, you know, getting legal and taxation advice and those kinds of things. There's the direct ongoing conservation management costs. There's the opportunity cost. And then there's the profit margin or the altruistic discount margin. You know, there's a trade-off between those two last elements. You know, how much am I willing to sort of take a hit because I'm conservation minded on what would otherwise be this opportunity cost, or how much am I minded to make 10% on this deal? So the conservation tenders gave that opportunity for the landholder to factor all of those things in and price accordingly. Now, in several of our tenders, we got a few outliers who were the sort of entrepreneurial types trying to game us. We had people that put in prices that were an order of magnitude higher than the successful tenderers, because they were essentially just trying to make profit out of us, right? So, you know, the value for money tests were really important. And we needed to have a view ourselves about what's a credible valuation here. And, you know, but typically you get a cluster of people putting in sensible bids and occasionally a few crazy outliers. So yeah, that's how it worked. Essentially, the more you're willing to pay, the more participation you'll get. Yeah. And we were in a very fortunate position of having some serious money. You know, if you were to ask me why was it $45 million, you know, I wrote a business case for that, well, 70 million. It was a judgment around, initially it was a judgment around what we thought voluntary uptake might look like. You know, now, with the benefit of hindsight, I wish we'd gone for 3 times as much, because if we'd gone for 3 times as much, we would have been doing it at the kind of pace we need to be doing it at to hit 30 by 30 by 2050. And after 3 years, the evidence suggests there was plenty of untapped demand out there, right? So, you know, if you're willing to pay and there are a lot of other advantages in doing this. From a business point of view, you've got a diversified source of income that's drought-proof, you know, so you might be getting 1/3 of your income now from biodiversity conservation and 2/3 of your income from a highly volatile production side of your business.
Yeah, I have 2 questions about voluntary, the non-funded agreements. The first question, because my understanding, the BCT normally offer the opportunity for landholders with big property size, minimum 20 hectares in general. Yeah, so do you think, yeah, especially for example, looking at koala habitat somehow in the coastal regions, this is one of the barriers I identified in my PhD. So some landholders or officers will say, oh, we've got very good koala habitats, but landholders cannot meet the minimum 20 hectares criteria. So do you think it's possible, because in Southern Queensland, the 9 councils, they offer the local council level covenants. So they will provide timely support as well to landholders. And sometimes they can covenant the area even like 1 hectare, even less. So do you think similar model may be applied in New South Wales in the future to not only BCT, Yeah, but maybe considering some local councils to fund the important property and also provide the services to them. And second question is related to this one, but how you deliver this landholder stewardship support right now, like there, because BCT, some region like in north coast, maybe only one staff is impossible. So are you relying on like land care or even land for wildlife agreement is not really coordinated in New South Wales?
Yeah.
So how
Yeah.
how it's going to work ideally in the future?
Yeah, look, I'm not an ecologist, so I'm not an expert on the thresholds question. Suffice to say that I would always, in my role at BCT as the CEO, I was always wanting to be guided by the scientists in terms of, how do we set our eligibility criteria to optimise outcomes. So, it may well be that those criteria shift over time if you've ticked off some of your higher priority goals. There was always an argument that there were high value sites that were smaller in your coastal zones relative to your inland, and then in the west. We were looking at making some changes. For example, we had a fairly blunt grants structure, and I wanted us to refine that to reflect some of these sorts of issues. So it's partly about continuous improvement and refinement, and that question of optimisation of your arrangements. So we were always having internal debates about relative priorities, eligibility thresholds, all that sort of stuff. So I hope that answers your first question. On the second question, we did have a strong partnership with Landcare. We did have a partnership with Land for Wildlife. We were very much trying to avoid the third category of PLC agreements in New South Wales, which are wildlife refuges, which we very much saw as an entry-level agreement. They were registered on title, but they were immediately revocable by a landholder. So we were trying to steer anyone who wanted to play in that space to Land for Wildlife, and also the Humane Society International's equivalent program. And we were providing some grants to those two organisations to assist them to run that. We saw that more as an entry-level programs where people might get comfortable with the idea and then maybe upgrade to a BCT agreement in time. Look, landholder support, while I say we put more into it, we were still spread incredibly thinly. And, that's a matter of, again, I could have decided to spend 35 million a year on operations and only invest 35 million a year in new agreements. So again, it's that balancing act between how much can you provide support. We were also trying to, initially there was a lot of focus on one-on-one support, and we were trying to move towards, one-to-many support mechanisms. So, guidelines, workshops, seminars where you invite 20 landholders to one site. How do you have the best impact in terms of technical support? The other thing is that you had spectrum of landholders from very, very competent through to people that really needed to rely on external contractors. So how do you design your support program to be responsive to all of those different needs? Look, to some extent, it's a bottomless pit. Ideally, you'd be out there providing 3 times as much support as we were, but ultimately you have to cut your cloth. Yeah. Hope that answers your questions. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Paul, for the really nice talk and sharing the insights. Just really interested on the part where you mentioned about the adaptive management, and you mentioned that there is a 5-year review of the existing agreement. That sounds like a really daunting task for, given the amount of agreement that New South Wales have. And just wondering if those review will be, is there what's the outcome of those review? Will it be published, or is it internally available for BCT and sharing with the landholders only? And moving forward from there, in terms of the management of the land, would there be any changes? Would there be, like, for example, if the target is for koala or for certain species, but moving forward, there's no more the species there, would there be funding cut, or is there like more support to plant more trees or something? Like, what's the outcome of that?
We certainly wouldn't have ever contemplated a funding cut, because that would have been a breach of good faith in my view. Look, I left at the 5-year mark, so I wasn't there for any reviews, so I hope it's working. I mean, there really were an internal collaborative review between the landholder and the VCT, and there'd only be a small subset of landholders that would probably trigger a request for a review, I'd imagine. Martine had to go.
Sorry.
You know, it's not intended to be a sort of public process. It's really meant to be, you know, it's really, again, as I said before, it's giving landholders comfort that if some circumstances do change, there's a pressure relief valve to review and adjust the management regime. If it gets to the point where, I mean, it's a good question I probably haven't ever thought about. If it gets to the point because of, say, climate change, that a site is so radically changed that it's not a viable agreement anymore, you know, I don't know what you would do in that scenario, but it'd be nice to think that there'd be a pragmatic approach to dealing with that kind of scenario. The other question I get asked about a lot, which no one's asked today, is force majeure events. What happens, you know, if there's a fire and or floods, and we had both in my time at VCT, which did a lot of harm to a lot of our sites. We actually responded to that by modifying our small grants program to recognise that people needed additional support. Because a lot of people, you know, after a fire, obviously you have much bigger problems with weed incursions or whatever. So we actually got very proactive around supporting. In terms of the legal side of it, the way that our agreements were structured was an obligation to bring the site back over time to a natural condition again. And with the northeast floods, you know, in around northern New South Wales, we had a few sites that were just completely wiped out, you know, so they were in a situation of having to just start over. But, you know, our agreements recognise that those scenarios arise, and we wanted to be reasonable about that, not punitive about it, obviously. Yeah.
Just throwing a comment when we were talking about reviews. When I was working in government, we were often involved in legislative reviews, especially statutory reviews of subordinate legislation, and their timelines for that vary from state to state. I think that the success of those reviews varied a lot, and there certainly would be public consultation about them, and there's a key element, but often there's not a lot of resources within the people that need to be involved in reviewing in government to get stuff done within these timeframes. So they often get pushed out, you know, with approved extensions and so forth. But I guess one of the most worrying things with some of these reviews at the end of the day is whether there's enough information that's been accumulated on the effectiveness of the existing legislation and what needs to be changed.
Yeah, absolutely. And in our space, that's really challenging because we know that outcomes take a long time to reveal themselves. We put quite a lot of effort and investment into our ecological monitoring module, as we call it, program. You know, I have a personal philosophy that you probably should invest about 10% in monitoring. Now, we were able to do it a bit more cheaply than that in the VCT through various economies of scale, but yeah, that was very much aimed at starting to provide evidence about the ecological condition of the PLC estate and whether it was holding, going backwards, going forwards. But that will only start to, by the time I left, we'd done our first baseline report. So that's a real challenge because you do have these 5-yearly reviews of legislation. You'll have constant challenges to
10 years in Queensland, I think.
Right, but you'll have constant challenges. Every year I had to fight the good fight again with Treasury to preserve this model. You know, they were perplexed by this idea of an accumulating capital fund, and I'd have to re-prosecute the argument every year as to why this made sense in this particular set of arrangements. So, you know, you've always got that existential threat of government changing its mind, or future governments changing their mind about a model like this. So you do need to accumulate evidence of success. And you also need to build a constituency of voices. So another real challenge here was, this arose also in the biodiversity offset scheme, where the the developers have very loud voices because they get organised, they can afford to get organised, they have industry lobbies, et cetera, but landholders in the private land conservation space, including those supplying offsets into the offset scheme, are a very diffuse, voiceless group. So we were actually starting to think, before I left, we were starting to think about creating a voice for the private land conservation sector in New South Wales, so that we could get them heard by bureaucrats and ministers as much as, well, maybe not as much, but hopefully trying to match how much they were hearing from other stakeholders in this regime. But building also a constituency of support, so that, I mean, who would, notwithstanding issues about how well funded they are, et cetera, but who would ever contemplate that a government would try to get rid of, say, the National Parks and Wildlife Service? You know, they might defund it, they might not properly fund it, but they'd never get rid of it. And so one of my aspirations for this model was for the BCT to become a standing institution within the environment portfolio arrangements in New South Wales in one form or another. Give it you know, relevance and credibility so that it would be hard to get rid of. Some of the funding model helps to support that too, because it is effectively a trust holding monies under in perpetuity arrangements. And if a government ever tried to unravel that, they would effectively have to pay just terms compensation. So that would be a big step for any government to take. So part of the policy design was trying to build longevity into the model as well. But yeah, I mean, statutory reviews. Interestingly, in New South Wales, they commissioned Ken Henry to do the 5-year statutory review of the BC Act, and he gave them a very, very challenging report that they're still chewing on in New South Wales. And there's been thundering silence from the government so far, because, you know, he pushed them pretty hard around trying to put in place a nature positive regime with the environment having primacy. There's some really good rhetoric in the but no, you know, it's good that Ken's out there pushing the envelope, but whether they'll have the political ability to shift the dial towards a more nature positive regime is going to be a really interesting question. The PLC side of it is nature positive, especially if there was more investment, but there's some deep flaws in the biodiversity offset scheme in New South Wales that still haven't been addressed, in my opinion.
Anyone else have any other questions? No? Oh, yeah.
I just want to with the sheep and wheat belt area there. What is the on the ground work that the conservation agreements were looking like there?
Look, it would really vary site by site. It would really depend so much on, you know, what the property looked like, how much ramified veg was there, you know, what habitat was there. So it was very much, every agreement was tailored to each individual site, you know, and then it would be a case of, well, which landscape are you in and which are the biggest threat? You know, is it goats, is it pigs, is it, you know, weeds, all of the above? Do you need to do stock exclusion? We did have a, one thing that we grappled with quite a lot was the question of conservation grazing. And the BCT actually promulgated some conservation grazing guidelines. So some sites in suitable landscapes, you can actually envisage them as conceptually as 3 zones. So they would have a residual production zone, a purely conservation area, but then there'd be a 3rd area still included in the conservation agreement that was where we would enable and allow conservation grazing. So we had carefully crafted guidelines around how you could use that as a legitimate conservation management tool. So it really would be about restricting grazing to certain months of the year where it would assist with managing exotic species and not do harm to native species. And that was quite a positive for some of those types of landholders to be able to have that 3rd option in the mix. Yeah, so yeah, it would really depend a lot. One of the biggest issues in terms of upfront cost was often the issue of fencing. You know, for Nimikara, for example, we had to fund a hell of a lot of complex, dynamic, temporary fencing arrangements because it's a very dynamic water-based landscape. So that was quite a complex design. But again, I would defer to all of my technical people for the real answers on all those questions.
Okay, great, thank you.
Right, so another big thank you to Paul for coming to speak to us. We're going to be around for the next few days, is that right?
Yeah, I'm here tomorrow and Thursday morning, coming to the conservation catch-up thing this afternoon.
That's at 2 o'clock.
But a couple of you want to grab me to set up time for discussion, we'll do that. But thank you very much for your time.